Quick test before we start. Name every country currently at war right now. Take a second. Most people get to 3, maybe 4. Ukraine, Gaza, and if they follow the news closely, Iran. Here's the actual number according to the researchers who track this professionally. Somewhere between 50 and 56 active armed conflicts are happening on this planet right now. And depending on how strictly you define major war, between 14 and 20 of them are large enough to be killing people by the thousands. Here's a comparison that should genuinely bother you. In 2022, a slap at the Oscars, one celebrity hitting another celebrity on a stage in Los Angeles, received, according to one humanitarian organization's tracking, nearly 100 times more global media coverage than the food crisis unfolding in Malawi at the exact same time. That's not a rounding error. That's not a niche academic complaint. That's the actual measured gap between what the world pays attention to and what's actually happening in it. So here's what this video is actually going to do. Walk through the wars killing people right now that you've probably never heard mentioned on the news, explain with real data exactly why you haven't heard about them, and then look at the specific mechanism, not vague cynicism about the media, but an actual measured, quantified explanation for why some wars get covered and others simply don't. Before we get into it, one important note on how this video handles a genuinely difficult subject. Every conflict covered here involves real, ongoing human suffering, and several of the figures and characterizations cited, including formal genocide determinations, come from specific institutions, governments, UN bodies, and independent researchers, whose findings are noted as such. Where a characterization is contested, or where death toll estimates vary significantly between sources, that range and that disagreement will be stated directly rather than presented as a single settled number. This is Endgame Analysis. If you want the real data-backed map of a world that's considerably more violent right now than most people realize, subscribe right now before we get into it, because the gap between what's happening and what you've heard about is bigger than you think. Before we get into the wars almost nobody's talking about, it's worth being precise about the handful that do dominate global coverage, because the contrast is the entire point of this video. The Russia-Ukraine war, now in its 4th year since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, remains the largest conventional interstate war in Europe since the Second World War, with total casualties on both sides now estimated above 500,000. The Israel-Gaza war, which we've covered in detail on this channel before, has reshaped the Middle East and generated more sustained international coverage than almost any conflict in recent memory. And the Iran war, which erupted after coordinated American and Israeli strikes in February 2026, killed Iran's supreme leader and triggered a new direct confrontation with global oil market implications, has dominated headlines for months. Those 3 conflicts are genuinely significant, and nothing in this video is meant to argue otherwise. But according to the same researchers who track Ukraine and Gaza this closely, they represent maybe 3 out of 50 or more active armed conflicts happening on Earth at this exact moment. The other 47 or so simply don't get anywhere close to the same attention, even when the human toll rivals or exceeds what's happening in the wars you already know about. It's worth pausing on why even the basic count is so hard to pin down to a single number, because that ambiguity itself is revealing. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program, one of the most widely cited academic sources for tracking global conflict, defines a war using a specific threshold, at least 25 battle-related deaths in a given conflict per year. A bar that's precise, but that also means the exact list of wars shifts from year to year as specific conflicts cross above or fall below that line. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project takes a different approach entirely, tracking hundreds of thousands of individual violent events, rather, than trying to sort them into a single master list of named wars at all. Depending on which methodology you use and how strictly you define major, you can defensively arrive at very different headline numbers, anywhere from the low 20s to well over 50. What doesn't change across every single one of these different counting methods is that the true number is dramatically higher than the 3 or 4 conflicts most people could actually name off the top of their head. Let's start with the conflict that researchers and humanitarian organizations consistently describe as the single most severe gap between actual severity and public awareness anywhere on the planet right now: Sudan. The war between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support forces has been raging since April 2023, and the numbers, even the conservative ones, are almost impossible to fully process. Death toll estimates range from 150,000 to as many as 400,000 people. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, one of the most rigorous conflict trackers in the world, has confirmed more than 58,000 fatalities through direct documentation, while explicitly noting the true number is certainly far higher, since large parts of the country remain inaccessible to the kind of on-the-ground reporting that would allow a more precise count. The displacement numbers are, if anything, even more staggering. As of 2026, more than 15 million people have been displaced by this single conflict, roughly 11.8 million inside Sudan itself, and another 4.2 million who've crossed into neighboring Chad, Egypt, and South Sudan as refugees. That makes Sudan's war the largest displacement crisis on Earth right now, larger than Ukraine's, larger than Gaza's, and it's a title that receives almost none of the attention those two conflicts do. Subscribe to Endgame Analysis if the scale of what you're hearing right now surprises you, because Sudan gets considerably worse before this section is over. In October 2025, the RSF captured the city of El Fasher in Darfur, the culmination of an 18-month siege that left more than 70,000 civilians dead in a matter of weeks as the siege finally broke. A UN fact-finding mission investigating the aftermath concluded the violence bore what it specifically called the hallmarks of genocide, documenting mass killings, systematic sexual violence, and the deliberate targeting of non-Arab ethnic communities. This wasn't the first such finding. In January 2025, the United States State Department had already made its own formal determination that the RSF was committing genocide in Darfur, a specific legally significant designation that a government doesn't make lightly. And the violence has only escalated further into 2026. UN monitoring found that armed drone strikes, deployed by both the Sudanese army and the RSF, were responsible for more than 80% of civilian deaths nationwide in just the first 4 months of this year, killing at least 880 people directly, with drone strikes in the Kordofan region, alone killing more than 1,000 people since the start of 2026. Strikes have hit hospitals, markets, water infrastructure, and displacement camps, spreading well beyond Darfur into Blue Nile, White Nile, and Khartoum itself, including a May 2026 strike on Khartoum's international airport that grounded all flights. The scale of this specific war has produced consequences that extend well beyond the immediate death toll and displacement figures. Nearly half of Sudan's entire population now lacks access to adequate food, and famine has been formally declared. In parts of Darfur and Kordofan, with humanitarian agencies warning it's likely to spread further if the conflict continues. The country's collapse into lawlessness has also created fertile ground for entirely separate criminal networks to expand. Authorities seized roughly half a ton of crystal methamphetamine in Port Sudan in early 2026 and discovered a lab in Al Jaili capable of producing 100,000 Captagon tablets an hour, evidence that trafficking networks displaced from other collapsing. States in the region have moved swiftly to exploit Sudan's power vacuum. The conflict has also drawn in a wide, complicated web of outside actors, with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey broadly backing the Sudanese army, while the United Arab Emirates has been widely identified as the RSF's principal external patron, turning what began as a domestic power struggle between two factions into a proxy conflict with regional dimensions few outside observers are tracking closely. Journalists covering Sudan have been remarkably direct about why this specific war has struggled so badly for coverage, even relative to other underreported conflicts. Foreign correspondents have had extremely limited ability to actually enter the country throughout the war, and Sudan's information environment was already one of the most difficult and dangerous in the world for journalists well before this specific conflict began. Google search interest in Sudan, one researcher found, spiked briefly when the war started in April 2023, then declined within a couple of weeks, and has stayed roughly flat ever since, a pattern that shows up in the actual measured public attention data, not just in anecdotal complaints about media coverage. Move roughly 2,000 miles southwest, and you land on a second conflict that, by scale alone, should be dominating international coverage and largely isn't: the war in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. The M23 rebel group, a predominantly Tutsi militia that UN investigations and multiple Western governments have documented as receiving direct military support from neighboring Rwanda, restarted its offensive in the eastern DRC in 2021 and has been steadily seizing territory ever since. In January 2025, M23 forces captured Goma, the capital of North Kivu province, and normally a city of over 1 million residents, in an assault that UN estimates put at killing at least 2,900 people, with more than 500,000 additional people displaced in the weeks immediately following. The following month, M23 captured Bukavu, the capital of South Kivu, and the second largest city in eastern Congo, extending the group's control over 2 major provincial capitals within a matter of weeks. The scale of displacement across the region as a whole is difficult to fully grasp. As of 2026, roughly 7.3 million people have been internally displaced across eastern DRC, among the highest displacement figures anywhere in Africa and one of the highest in the world. Human Rights Watch has documented M23 committing war crimes throughout its advance, including killings, indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, and widespread sexual violence. alongside forced displacement operations. In one case, ordering tens of thousands of people out of displacement camps around Goma with just 72 hours' notice. Subscribe to Endgame Analysis now, because this conflict actually connects to a detail that helps explain why it persists the way it does, and it isn't simply about ethnic tension. Eastern Congo sits on some of the most valuable mineral deposits on Earth, including coltan, gold, tin, and tungsten, materials essential to global electronics manufacturing, and competition for control of that mineral wealth is widely understood by researchers, studying the conflict to be a central, ongoing driver of the fighting, layered on top of ethnic tensions, tracing back to the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. As of August 2026, the DRC government and the M23-led rebel alliance had agreed to a roadmap for peace talks following negotiations in Switzerland, but fighting on the ground has continued even as those talks proceed, with both sides deploying drones and heavy artillery in populated areas as recently as mid-2026. It's worth naming the historical shadow this specific conflict operates under, because it explains why regional actors and analysts alike watch developments in Eastern Congo so nervously. The devastating Congo Wars of the late 1990s and early 2000s, sometimes referred to as Africa's World War, eventually drew in 7 separate African militaries and are estimated to have killed roughly 5.04 million people, making them among the deadliest conflicts anywhere on Earth since the Second World War. And yet, a conflict of that scale registers only faintly in most Western historical memory. The current M23 offensive, with Rwanda's documented backing, has revived genuine fears among regional security analysts that a similar, wider regional conflagration could be triggered again, drawing in additional neighboring states beyond the parties already directly involved. That risk, a conflict with the demonstrated historical potential to become one of the deadliest wars of the modern era, receives a level of ongoing international attention that doesn't remotely match the stakes involved. Sudan and Congo at least occasionally surface in international coverage, even if the volume falls dramatically short of what their scale would justify. There's an entire additional tier of conflicts that barely register at all, even among people who follow international news closely. Myanmar's civil war, fought between the military junta that seized power in a 2021 coup and a coalition of more than 20 different ethnic armed groups and resistance forces, has now reached a genuinely historic phase, with resistance forces controlling large swaths of the country's territory for the first time in the conflict's history. Roughly 3.6 million people have been displaced nationwide, and humanitarian organizations estimated in 2026 that $890 million would be needed just to reach 4.9 million people in need across the country. The junta has announced plans for elections, but independent analysts have widely described holding a credible national vote amid an active, ongoing civil war as effectively impossible, a detail that itself illustrates how difficult it is for outside observers, let alone international news audiences, to track where the specific conflict actually stands at any given moment. Beyond Myanmar, researchers tracking global conflicts in 2026 have identified an entire category they describe as invisible wars, conflicts that rarely, if ever, surface in mainstream Western coverage at all. Ongoing violence across the Sahel region of West Africa, cross-border clashes between Pakistan and Afghanistan that killed dozens of civilians in a single week in early 2026, cartel violence in Mexico that has claimed tens of thousands of lives in recent years, armed conflict in Cameroon, Somalia, Ethiopia, and Libya, the long-frozen but periodically violent Nagorno-Karabakh dispute, unrest in West Papua, and ongoing state suppression of Uyghur and Tibetan populations. Individually, several of these conflicts might not generate enough sustained international attention to earn a single dedicated segment on a major news broadcast in an entire year. Collectively, they represent millions of people living through active violence that essentially never enters the public conversation most people are having about what's happening in the world at any given moment. Here's where this video moves past simply listing underreported wars and into the part that actually matters most: a rigorous, data-backed explanation for why this gap exists, because the media doesn't care, is too vague to actually be useful. A 2026 research study analyzed 78,667 news articles covering 10 of the world's most urgent humanitarian crises, drawing from English-language media across 8 countries, to measure exactly how coverage volume compared to actual humanitarian severity. The findings were stark. Gaza coverage averaged 58.5 articles per day. Ukraine averaged 19.4 articles per day. Gaza coverage, specifically, was 9 times greater than coverage of Afghanistan and 60 times greater than coverage of Ethiopia. Ukraine coverage was 3 times higher than Afghanistan and 20 times higher than Ethiopia. And critically, the researchers found this disparity couldn't be explained by humanitarian impact alone. Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have all experienced mass displacement, famine, and civilian casualties at levels comparable to, or in some cases exceeding, the crises receiving dramatically more coverage. Subscribe to Endgame Analysis if you want to understand the actual mechanism behind that gap, because researchers studying this pattern have a specific explanation, and it isn't a conspiracy, it's a predictable, well-documented feature of how news organizations decide what counts as a story. Media researchers point to what's called news values theory, developed originally by Galtung and Rug, and later refined by Harkup and O'Neill, which identifies the specific factors that consistently determine which stories editors and journalists select for coverage, proximity to Western powers, involvement of politically significant or elite nations, the presence of clear conflict and drama, and strong visual impact. A war involving a European nation invaded by a nuclear-armed neighbor checks nearly every one of those boxes simultaneously. A war between a paramilitary group and a government army in a country most Western audiences couldn't locate on a map, fought largely in regions foreign journalists can't safely or practically access, checks almost none of them, regardless of how many people are actually dying or being displaced.